So this is the scripture study ahead of the fifth Sunday of Epiphany in year B. The lectionary text is Mark 1, verses 29 to 38. And we're going to look at that specifically, but also more generally as a kind of archetypal story about healing and exorcism, which are definitely things that happen. And we're going to look more broadly at some of the implications of those types of events in Gospels from the perspective of empire and the perspective of authority. And we're going to come to a few different conclusions. So there isn't a big finale to this. There isn't one thesis. There are multiple different perspectives, and it's up to you to consider what is helpful to you, what shows love in your life, and what also maybe sidesteps some of the problems that these texts can generate for us. So let's get into this. Oh, just to mention, this painting is one of my favorites. It is not the miracle that we were talking about in particular. It is not the healing of Simon's mother. But as a kid, you just kind of got to love a painting where it looks like Jesus is sticking his finger up someone's nose. So a bit into the background. Oh, sorry. Let me not skip a slide here. The background. So we're in the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark is the main gospel for this whole cycle, this whole year, from Advent all the way until Advent in November of 2024. And so this is what we call in the Revised Common Lectionary Year B. And the focus every of the 3 years picks one gospel to focus on. So this is Mark. Last year was Matthew. Next year will be in year C, Luke. Mark is pretty special. We think that the majority of scholarship thinks that Mark was an important text that both Matthew and Luke consulted when they were writing their gospels, or these communities were writing their gospels later, and that's part of why so much of Mark shows up in Matthew or Luke, but there's a lot of Matthew and Luke that doesn't show up in Mark. So this is called Markan priority, that Mark came first, basically. There are also some passages that both Matthew and Luke share that Mark doesn't have. So we think that because there's so much similarity in these passages that they both share, that Matthew and Luke also consulted another document that was lost. Because we don't have a name for it, it's just called Q, sort of like the variable X in algebra. And that's a source document for Matthew and Luke. Of course, Matthew and Luke are not the same, so they probably also consulted some other texts on the side as well that were special to them, that gave them their own flavor. And each of these Gospels has their own emphasis, their own audience, their own purpose. Whether or not we're able to actually determine all of these things perfectly is we probably can't, but we can do a good job, and we can do a lot of inquiry based on the tools that we have. So that gives us some of the clues to when Mark was written, for example, who Mark was written for, the community, and maybe some of the why, although we get more certain from the when and the who, and then less certain about the why. One of the main things to note about Mark is that Mark tends to focus very heavily on miracles. There is a larger percentage of Mark than any other gospel that's dedicated to the miracles of Jesus. And that's kind of wonderful for us, especially this time of year in Epiphany, which is a time of the lectionary that we look at the miracles of Jesus in particular, but also many of the miracles that had to deal with people's bodies, that had to do with healing. And that kind of recalls the gifts of the Magi that kind of start the season of Epiphany, that it's the realization, the Epiphany of Jesus as this really complicated Messiah or a messianic figure, in that Jesus is both, regarded as a king with the gift of gold, but also as very mortal, not the all-powerful, all-ruling, the conquering king, as indicated by the gifts of myrrh and frankincense, which are embalming spices, which point to the fact that Jesus's death is hinted at from the very beginning of his birth. So, not necessarily what one might expect, someone that's associated with God or divinity, right? Death, mortality, human frailty, human decay of our bodies. So to talk then about miracles that are healing of the body, recalls the ideas of both healing as well as our frailty as human beings, the fact that we get sick, that we need help. that we do need healing. So it's really kind of wonderful to be able to read Mark in this year. And not to say that Matthew and Luke don't all have their own contributions, but Mark and Epiphany, it's like, I don't know, steak and Cabernet Sauvignon, or in my case, Barolo. Just goes well together. Okay, so what do we know about Mark? Mark, we think, was written sometime around a really important event that is the destruction of the Second Jewish Temple. That's what's depicted in this painting here. That we know that that happened in 70 CE. That happened under the command of Titus, who would then become the next emperor of Rome. And it was the conclusion to a multi-year civil, well, no, that's the wrong word, revolt. It's the Jewish-Roman revolt, the first revolt. It started as a result, this historical event, it's absolutely historical. It's not anything about mythology. It happened because of overtaxation, about reallocation of temple taxes that Roman political rulers were stealing from the temple, the money that had been dedicated to God. It had happened because of tension, interreligious tension between Jews in this area and people who were not Jewish, who were increasingly living in their cities. And that conflict of faiths coming together that didn't agree. Also, growing stratification in society, very, very rich, a small number of very, very rich Jewish elites that were collaborators with Roman authorities, and a very large, increasingly impoverished and displaced peasantry, farmers, people who were just surviving and then not surviving. So you had a large number of very, very angry people, and that spilled over when you combine that with religious injury to revolt, open revolt. And they were very successful at the beginning. They did successfully drive off Roman legions. They were able to reclaim land and rule pretty much as an independent Jewish state for a few years before they were thoroughly in 70 defeated. Jerusalem was essentially razed to the ground. The temple was completely destroyed. And the reason that we can date Mark's authorship to about this time is that Mark doesn't seem to be entirely aware of this event happening, although probably could see that the Jewish revolt was doomed to fail. So we can date it to right around the same time as this. So we think it might have been written in the last half of the 60s CE to maybe the early part of the 70s, because we're not completely sure how widespread or how quickly news traveled about these events. Okay. So first thing out of the way, when? Who was the community of Mark? We think that it was a Latin-speaking city, but a Greek audience within it because it's written in Greek. But the Greek here that's used in Mark is particular. There are loan words that are derived from Latin. There are expressions in Greek that are direct translations of original Latin expressions. And so this shows to us that it's a Greek-speaking population, but that's in contact with Latin-speaking people. So that narrows it down a lot. There is a kind of mythical connection by a letter of Papias between Peter, who was martyred in Rome, and Mark. And so there is an association, a traditional association between Mark, the gospel being written in Rome, and that as likely as anywhere else. So if we had to guess one place where this gospel was written, Rome is where we guess. We know about these Greek speakers that they did not know Aramaic, and we know that the recipients, these Greek speakers, were not themselves Jews. And that's because in the Gospel of Mark, there's time taken to explain Jewish ritual, which would not have been necessary if people themselves were familiar with Judaism. But we know that they had some knowledge of Judaism because of the vocabulary that's used that's unique to the Jewish faith that doesn't get explained. So, for example, Satan, Gehenna, Rabbi, Hosanna, Amen, all of these are words that would be particular to someone who had come into contact with Judaism, but not necessarily someone who had been Jewish themselves. So we suspect that this is a population of Christians who had converted to Christianity, and the people that had helped them through that conversion, the evangelists that had reached this population of people, were perhaps either themselves originally Jewish, and so therefore used Jewish words, but didn't explain all the Jewish faith, or had themselves come in contact with Judaism. So this population is one step removed from Judaism. So words have transferred, but not necessarily the cultural knowledge behind those words. What did they think? What was important to them? One of the really striking things about Mark is its immediacy, its kind of breathless structure. And so many of the sentences either start with the word immediately itself or start with the word and, which kind of string the sentences together so that you're kind of running through the entire thing, just and this and this. And it's really easy to isolate and know that a verse comes up from Mark because not so many other verses start with the word and. It's not a great grammatical way to start a sentence, but it is particular to Mark. Why were they so concerned with, why were they so breathless? There is an expectation throughout Mark, an unusually large expectation, prominent expectation about Jesus's second coming, that it is close at hand, it is imminent. And perhaps we conjecture that the reason that this was so important to this community was because they were undergoing persecution at that time. And so they were looking for their salvation. They were looking for how this would all end, what would bring this to a close, what would be their saving from this current persecution. And so that's why they looked to the second coming of God, of Jesus. Some other things to know that maybe are just interesting. Mark omits the Lord's Prayer and Beatitudes. Those are not featured here. Mark has essentially no birth narrative. Jesus enters the scene at his baptism. We don't know where Jesus comes from in Mark. And there's very little death narrative or rather post-death, post-resurrection narrative. There are two different endings of Mark, so that books can, early manuscripts either end at the short ending or indicate that that is the original ending and also include other verses, but don't string them together as if it's one longer narrative. So there is an awareness that there are two endings and that there's material that was added secondarily. So that's another thing. And in that short edition is a little bit more of the post-resurrection narrative about Jesus Christ. But other than that, then if without that, at the shorter ending, pretty much it ends right after the disciples see the empty tomb. There isn't a lot of transmission of teaching or of Jesus's experience after resurrection. That just doesn't exist in the Gospel of Mark. Where did Mark come from? Right. So we know that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as source material. But what was Mark's source material? We do have some sense of that. These texts. One is the Gospel of Peter, which has been lost in its entirety or as an entire book, but we do have fragments of. The other is the secret Gospel of Mark. And again, fragments, and we think that these were representative of the types of documents that might have been the original source material for Mark. Things to know, but also at this point, there is a tendency in the United States, in Western culture, to identify heavily with Rome. If you want proof for that here in the United States, think about how many symbols of Rome are associated with our government, our history, our sense of being a country and a people. The motto that is on the back of our $1 bill that expresses our identity as a country, one out of many, de pluribus unum, is in Latin. We have a Senate that governs over us. Our architecture, our art. If you look up in the Capitol Dome, you see the apotheosis of George Washington. So it's a classical imagery of George Washington being elevated to a god. There is so much Roman influence. We even think about our history in Roman terms. We talk about the Pax Americana, a reference to the Roman piece, the Pax Romana, which is a historical period of Roman rule. Good to note that that's not actually very peaceful unless you're a rich person in Rome. It's kind of a horrible time for everyone living on the margins whose lives are, and livelihoods are dedicated to supporting the rich fat people in Rome. Not too much like the Pax Americana as well. But just to say that because we so identify closely with Rome in this country, it's oftentimes difficult for us to see past that. So that when we look at Rome's influence in the world that was Palestine around the time of Jesus, we oftentimes identify with Rome, or it's just natural for us because that's how we identify today. And so that becomes invisible to us And so this is part of why when you see a traditional interpretation of the Gospel of Mark, um, writers from a Western perspective will oftentimes say things like, what's the point of the Gospel of Mark? What's unique about it? They'll say that it's about discipleship, or maybe it's about conflict between Jews and Christians. But that's where the analysis goes. However, if you don't identify with Rome, if you don't see this through a Western lens, there are other things that become really important in the Gospel of Mark. For example, you could say that Mark is a story about conflict. It's about a turbulent time of colonization by Rome, and it isn't very flattering to Rome. In fact, Jesus challenges authority throughout the Gospel of Mark, challenges directly Roman authority. And we don't see that when we identify with Rome. We wouldn't want to see Jesus as being opposed to ourselves. But it is a really, really good tool to look and see where conflict arises in this gospel, and to understand that Jesus is initiating the conflict, and Jesus is resisting power here in many cases. So he challenges Jewish religious authorities, Roman colonizers, proclaiming the kingdom of God in opposition to Roman rule. And this all comes to a head. The central moment in the Gospel of Mark is when Jesus goes to the temple and casts out the money changers. That is the moment in which Jesus is condemned, when he is recognized as an insurrectionist, and the political powers understand that Jesus must be killed. And that's what leads to Jesus' crucifixion, eventual resurrection. So it's the challenging of political authority that then results in the crucifixion, in Jesus being killed. So when we talk about things like exorcisms and healings, we're going to think about that in terms of, where is power? Is Jesus challenging power right now? What is Jesus' position or relationship with power? Who is opposed to Jesus? And all of that will be coloring our understanding, taking the themes of the larger gospel, and then find how does this one story of a healing miracle or an exorcism miracle fit in with that larger narrative. Okay, that's a lot. So this is the story for today. I'm going to read through it. They came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and began to teach. The people were spellbound by the teaching, because Jesus taught with an authority that was unlike their religious scholars. Suddenly, a person with an unclean spirit appeared in their synagogue. It shrieked, "What do you want from us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked the spirit sharply. "Be quiet. Come out of that person." At that, the unclean spirit convulsed the possessed one violently, and with a loud shriek, it came out. All who looked on were amazed. They began to ask one another, "What is this? A new teaching, and with such authority. This person even gives orders to unclean spirits, and they obey." Immediately, news of Jesus spread through the surrounding region of Galilee. Upon leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered Simon and Andrew's house with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told Jesus about her. Jesus went over to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up, and the fever left her. Then she went about her work. After sunset, as evening drew on, they brought to Jesus all who were ill and possessed by demons. Everyone in the town crowded around the door, but Jesus healed many who were sick with different diseases and cast out many demons. But Jesus would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew who he was. Rising early the next morning, Jesus went off to a lonely place in the desert and prayed there. Simon and some companions managed to find Jesus and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus said to them, "Let us move on to the neighboring village, so that I may proclaim the good news there also. That is what I have come to do." So Jesus went into their synagogues, proclaiming the good news and expelling demons throughout the whole of Galilee. Sorry, I just needed to adjust my screen so I could slide off the other screen. Let's talk about this. This is a great way to start to talk about miracles of healing and exorcisms. There are 4 basic sorts of miracles, and this has got 2 of them, healing and exorcism. The kind of formula for Jesus' healing miracles is that the subject is brought to Jesus' attention. Jesus encounters the subject. Jesus interacts with them, says something like, "What's wrong?" Jesus responds, touching the person, healing the person, and then the healing is reported. Those 4 elements are there in pretty much every story. And they're unique, right? They're not necessarily how you think healing might occur, because it's important that the subject is brought to Jesus's attention, um, or the subject identifies himself to Jesus. It is rare that Jesus goes out and finds people to heal. Um, and I think that has implications for the way that we act as Christians today, that we don't go into places assuming that we know what the solution is for something, that we are listening, that we listen to and we're curious about people, how they describe their problems to us. And we reach out with whatever way we can um, to be able to address the needs as they describe, rather than thinking that we have the solutions for them and that we know what's wrong with them in their lives. It's important that Jesus touches people, that Jesus interacts with them. Jesus doesn't just, um, you know, act from a distance. There's something very personal about that as well. So, though, let's look at this and also note some other things. It's interesting that Jesus teaches here, but we don't know anything about what Jesus teaches. We know that Jesus does teach people, but it seems like the point here is more about Jesus's authority. Jesus's power to perform miracles is understood as sign of his authority. So really what we learn here is that nothing about what Jesus taught. We learn that Jesus is teaching us that he has the power to do miracles. That's what we learn from this. So if there's a teaching here, it is that Jesus has power over demons. I guess we're learning that demons exist, that they are a real thing, and that Jesus has power over that. So the message is that he has authority. But there isn't anything about love your neighbor here. There isn't anything about blessed are the poor. There's simply, I have power over demons. And this actually fits a much larger trope in the Hellenistic world, where the wonder worker is glorified by performing the act. That's the point of this. Something else that's interesting here. Is it singular or plural, this demon? It changes throughout the story. There is an unclean spirit, and it leaves the person. So these are singular, but the spirit refers to itself in the plural. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. Yes, that's singular, but there is, oh, and have you come to destroy us? There is something going on, something interesting. It has been thought that one possible way to interpret that problem is that here the spirit really is being used to represent the scribes and the scribal authorities. So who exactly is Jesus claiming power over, against? It's not really a spirit here. It's not a demon. It's actually the scribes. So Jesus is representing power over the traditions, over the systems that existed. And in this case, that would be Jewish authorities, and saying that is what I actually have power, I command. One other thing to point out here, there's something unusual that's happening about Jesus telling spirits to be quiet. So it's unusual because the spirits are the only ones that recognize that Jesus is the Son of God, and the disciples do not. You'd think it'd be the other way around. But here in two instances, Jesus is commanding silence of the demons, both in verse 34 as well as in verse verse 25. That's right. This is something that occurs throughout Mark, the fact that Jesus is silencing people. And it's so prevalent, throughout Mark, that it has actually become a theme. And the name given to that idea is the Messianic secret. It was a very prominent area of scholarship about 120 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. There was the thought that was really key to understanding Mark, the significance of this secret. And the thought at that time was that this idea that Jesus was commanding silence, commanding secrecy about his identity, was not historical, that was added by the author later on when this gospel was written, but these were not original words of Jesus. The reason that this was added was because there were communities around the time of the authorship of this gospel, some that thought that Jesus was the Messiah, and some that thought that Jesus was not the Messiah. And to avoid conflict between those two different disagreeing viewpoints, the idea of a secret was invented to explain why some people might be in the know to know that Jesus was the Messiah, and some people might not know that because it was supposed to be a secret, and the secret was effectively held. So that way, everyone can agree that they can reconcile what they thought and agree that they're worshiping the same Jesus. And that it's just that the confusion was because Jesus had commanded secrecy. And that was thought to be a really key way to interpret the Gospel of Mark, that it was a very theological document, that it was speaking to problems of the time, that it wasn't necessarily Jesus's words themselves. Well, 120 years have passed, and we now think much less about this messianic secret. It's not necessarily the most important thing to understand about the Gospel of Mark, even though it comes up over and over and over again. We think that it's possible, now that we see older manuscripts, that the messianic secret still exists there, so we can trace farther back in time, that Jesus might have actually said something like this. This might not have been a creation by the author of the Gospel to address concerns of the communities. This might have actually been something that Jesus was concerned about. And the way we make sense of that now is to think that maybe Jesus didn't really have language to describe what exactly he was. There were some messianic expectations of him that were valid, that he agreed with, and some that he didn't. Some that he wasn't set out, that he didn't expect to fulfill. And so talking about his identity in terms of secrets was a way to be able to avoid some messianic expectations. But there just wasn't a really developed theological language at that time to express his identity otherwise. And so this is what was used. That's the state of where we are in scholarship nowadays. I just wanted to be able to discuss something that might otherwise seem really mysterious, and talk about how it can be understood, or different ways that it has been understood and how it can be understood. Moving on. So we've got our content now to talk about for the next 25 minutes. We're going to talk about miracles and exorcisms, how they are useful to us, how they're problematic, what they mean for us, how they can be used, how they can be abused. Okay, let's start with the good stuff. Miracles can be really wonderful aspects of our faith as Christians. I mentioned there are 4 categories of miracles. Here we have the healing ones and the exorcisms. In the book, in the Gospels, we also have miracles over elements of nature, like Jesus walking on water or Jesus making bread multiply, so non-animate objects. And we also have miracles about resurrection. So that would be Jesus's own resurrection, stories about Lazarus, things like that, coming back from the dead. Miracles are miracles because they meet 2 tests. They happened, they're historical, and they can't be explained by natural forces, because if someone would have recovered naturally on their own, it's not miraculous. And that person had to actually have recovered. So historical and not explainable. So they are supernatural. They break our understanding of what's supposed to happen. And for some people, that's really problematic, because the whole point is that we have laws because that's how the world works. And so the supernatural, the miraculous, just doesn't, some people find the need to explain that. And that was a really big preoccupation throughout the Enlightenment, through sometimes the 21st century, to try to think about miracles as healing illness. So there wasn't a demoniac. There was a woman with epilepsy, for example, and Jesus medically healed epilepsy, didn't drive out a spirit. That's something that's problematic for other reasons. But the potential here instead, well, let's think about it this way. Would it be the same if, instead of healing, that everywhere Jesus went, people won the lottery? Is it just like Oprah giving out gifts to people and changing people's lives for the better because they get good things? No. There's something I think we intuitively know that there's something very different between winning the lottery and being healed by Jesus. The promise of miracles is rested, or it comes from human need, human frailty. And God, the divine, the all-knowing, taking the time to see us, the God that created us with our frailty, created us to break down, to be mortal, to die, temporarily giving us a break from what would otherwise be inevitable. Of course, we know that these people eventually died. So the healing was for a particular instance, for a particular time. It wasn't the gift of immortality. It wasn't a perpetual healing. It was an instant, a relief of pain, an acknowledgement of great suffering in a moment, and God being present to that moment. That's what miracles are. It's important to understand that also there's another societal dimension here that is silent, but that would have been really obvious to anyone from that social context. So illnesses at that time, there's a difference between illnesses and diseases. Diseases are medical. Diseases are the result of us being able to see into a body and compare tissue that is abnormal, that is diseased, that is necrotic, whatever, to healthy tissue. They didn't have any of that knowledge back then. They saw illness. They saw outward signs of someone being wrong. And that was attributed to fault, to sin, to evil. And so the proper understanding in that time of illness was that you had done something wrong. You were sinful, and we need to keep you away from the rest of the community, or else that sin could spread. Remember the way that the laws of the Torah worked, that by sinning, you got unclean. And if you captured enough of that uncleanliness because you didn't repent, well, then you could really have some bad consequences for the entire community, the entire society of Judaism, that eventually, if enough uncleanliness had accumulated, that you might be driven from the land, that Israel might have lost its right to the land that had been given to them under the promise, or even worse yet, that God might leave, that God might have just picked up and packed up God's bags and left the Holy of Holies and said, no, you're too unclean for me. I can't reside here anymore. So those large fears caused people to associate illness with sin and assume that the correct solution to illness was repentance, that you went and offered sacrifices. And no surprise that things like excessive bleeding, the hemorrhaging woman, or the paralytic man, or the blind person probably weren't solved by offering a blood sacrifice at the temple. It was a misunderstanding, but it was how things were. But that meant that part of the suffering here in this story is being separated from community. So Jesus is doing two things. Whenever Jesus heals people, Jesus is not just changing their body, relieving them of physical suffering. Jesus is also welcoming them back into community. He is remembering community. So if we take the word like putting community back together. And that's incredible. So there is this healing of body, but also a healing of stigma, a healing of separation, a healing of loneliness. And that is happening here. It might be invisible to us, but it's definitely what was meaningful back then. So let's ask the question. We oftentimes think that miracles are supposed to be convincing. Well, if the miracles of Jesus were meant to really be a reason for faith, wouldn't it have been so much more effective for Jesus to have scheduled Jesus's life for the time of YouTube or video cameras, when we could have recorded these miracles and they could have been broadcast and people could believe as a result of seeing with their own eyes in a way that wasn't, just having to believe a story written 2,000 years ago? Wouldn't that just be so much more convincing? Sounds reasonable, but that's not what happened. So one way to take that, the fact that, are we supposed to believe a miracle that was written down in a text that could be interpreted, that could be misinterpreted, mistranslated, that could have been exaggerated? What are we supposed to do with these miracles? Are we supposed to come to faith as a result of them? Well, it's important to understand that people, it seems, didn't come to faith back then, that no churches sprung up of communities of people that had been healed. They were, and properly are understood as a personal connection, almost like personal revelation, something that exists between Jesus and that person. And oftentimes, because they are so personal, they aren't something that we can prove, they're open to allegory. So we can talk about Jesus healing bodies. We can also talk about Jesus challenging power. We can talk about Jesus exposing evil forces, expelling evil forces. And these are not just instances of individual demons. These are allegories that tell stories about larger themes to Jesus's life, larger aims for Jesus's actions. Okay, let's go on. Oh, one more thing. Jesus does, I should mention, Jesus does heal people on an individual basis, but Jesus does this in the context of villages and crowds. And I think that's important as well, that relatives and friends bring people to Jesus. And so there is the sense that we are healed not only as individuals, but partly because of the community that supports us as well. I think that's an important lesson for us today, as Christians as well, in our job to be able to be agents of healing. That even if it's Jesus that actually does the healing occurs because of the support, because of the care and concern of the community that surrounds an individual. Okay, so let's talk about the other side of miracles. They are problematic. They're certainly problematic for me. I'm like someone that likes to have things explained, and the point about miracles is that you can't explain them. We also know that miracles are dependent on our understanding of nature, that one age's miracles might be the next age's everyday natural phenomena. Think about supernova, which were certainly, very miraculous back when we didn't understand how stars were formed. But now, not so miraculous, more things that people learn about in seventh grade, earth science or astronomy textbooks. Uh, Eclipses used to be mysterious things to people. Aurora, natural phenomena that were magical, that were miraculous, that indicated, the vastness of God at one point. And now we talk about in terms of electrons and electric fields and magnetic fields, and moon occlusion. So it's shadows. So just remember that. That's something important for us to keep in mind. Um, Miracles are problematic in other ways, though. I mentioned that they are individual, and that historically we know that they didn't lead to faith, or that we don't have these stories of faith communities springing up of people becoming convinced and devoted followers of Jesus as a result of miracles. They're really thankful for being healed, but it generally ends there. We know that the first Christian communities didn't spring up until after Jesus's resurrection. That's what seems to have actually galvanized people to faith. But the miracles themselves, even though deeply personal and deeply meaningful, just don't seem to have done that. Um, they don't seem to have founded a movement or communities. Also, like I mentioned, these people still died. Uh, these miracles were not everlasting. They were addressing a particular instance. It's also important to know that after Jesus's death and after maybe the death of the disciples that Jesus had empowered to also heal people, we don't have many records of these healings after that either. There are, of course, in the Catholic tradition, a very rich tradition of miracles being attributed to saints. And that's maybe the one remnant of that that we don't really understand very well, even though it is very meaningful to some people, but largely not very predictable and not certainly on the scale of Jesus touching, healing whole crowds wherever Jesus went. They're individual miracles, and they seem to happen under really, really particular circumstances when we talk about saints that up to the modern day. One thing that's also maybe worth mentioning, but not giving any time to, Jesus's miracles aren't unique. We have many documented cases from around the world of many different cultures, different religious figures who also claim to have performed miracles. And we could easily dismiss that, saying, well, they can't be because that's not Jesus, that's not Christian. But that's a really circular logic. If we take these miracles at face value because someone said that they happened, then that's exactly the same evidence that we have from other miracles, from other faith traditions as well. And so we should accord them equal consideration, at least, even if we don't consider them to be true, at least consideration, because they meet the same criteria that ours do. To say that they couldn't have happened because Jesus is the only source of miracles just doesn't really hold water. Okay. So by the time the gospel's written, Jesus had already been gone for 30 years. So we think that already there hadn't been a lot of firsthand contact with these stories that happened. So we kind of have to understand the people that we're talking about miracles in the gospels are sort of in the same situation that we are, asking them questions that are really hard for faith to answer. Things like, what happens when healing doesn't occur? What does it mean? Does it mean that the person didn't want healing? Does it mean that they weren't worthy enough, that they had not wanted to be healed? It's a difficult question. Or more problematic, did God ignore prayer? Does a good God answer only some? Does it mean that some people are better at commanding God's attention? Or is God forgetful? Or did God get overwhelmed and let something drop? Or does God only respond when God has the right people asking? Does God play favorites? Or, these are just some illustrations. The problem is twofold. Not only because we have to explain why miracles sometimes don't happen, because truly a good God would want everyone to be healed, right? Not just some people. But we also have to ask, even if we were affected, we were in one of those wonderful rare cases where prayer was given, a miracle was sought, and a miracle happened. Someone's cancer went into sudden remission. Does that mean that certain people command God? That's equally problematic, I think. So we're taught in seminary, which is a Western tradition, a Christian tradition, I understand, that when we are praying in hospitals with people, and they ask for healing, like pray for my mother's cancer to go away, pray for my dad to wake up from this coma. We're taught to pray for healing in spirit, but not healing in body, because it shapes the wrong relationship. It shapes the wrong expectation of how God acts or how we interact with God. And it, in the end, could be more dangerous to set up unrealistic hope than to pray for the things that we know that God does always provide: the gifts of healing of spirit, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. And that's something that is not, the doctors can't tell us won't happen. So that's what we offer. So it could seem like a really watered down understanding of healing. That's not the healing that we want, clearly, that our hearts most desperately want in moments of great crisis. On the other hand, we have to think about what's actually happening, the other side of the miracle that I said, that there was a healing, but there was also reconciliation with community. These are things that we actually can offer. So in the case of this image, for example, we have to think about where the miracle is. Is this person disabled because they need assistance? Or is the fact that society has now provided ways for them to participate, whether through laws that demand accessible buildings, or through technology that allows for more easy transportation? Is this the miracle? And is this the type of healing that we're called to in this world as Christians? Not necessarily to be all doctors, although some of us are and can offer, amazing medical healing. Are we also called to understand and ask, what is my place to make sure that people don't feel separated, that people don't feel discriminated against because of what they are going through? And I think that that's something that definitely we as Christians can all do a lot of work in, even if we don't have the magic hands that Jesus did, or even the skilled hands of a surgeon or of a medically trained doctor. So the good news is that some of the problems are actually opportunities for us as Christians to actually still participate in healing, even if we aren't Jesus, even if Jesus is not walking the earth with us today. So there's a word here, theodicy. That's a really fancy word that just describes the problems that we have in explaining divine justice, why sometimes God acts and other times God seems to be really distant, why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people. These are some of the questions that miracles bring up for us. Just one other thing here I forgot to, but should mention. Miracles have led us to some dark places in our history as well. The spiritualization of medical conditions, to say that some medical conditions, especially mental illness, are conditions of the heart, and that an exorcism, for example, by a priest might solve something that really is a deeply felt mental health need. Or the medicalization of spiritual needs, things that really are conditions of the spirit being attempted to be treated with by medical means. So it just requires really careful thought. And these are some of the things that our faith can be confusing for if we're not really careful to think about it. Okay. Let's think a little bit more about disability, though, because I think this is a really interesting place for us to think about miracles, because there's one further way that we can ask questions about what is our role to be helpful. How do we make sense of this cases where someone might not want healing, where the idea of what is a disease or an illness is actually more a social construct as opposed to a physical condition? Now, that might seem really odd to say, but when we think about, for example, the deaf community, we think about the rich traditions of sign language, the culture that's developed around it, the communities of people who do not hear, who have lived for generations, because we know that some cases of hearing impairment are congenital in places like Nantucket or in Iowa, where there have been rich generations. If we assume that everyone who has a different body than we do needs healing, then sometimes we overlook the gifts of what people do have, and we don't listen to what they are asking for. There are, for example, Nancy Eiesland, the author of this book, The Disabled God, people who do not want to be healed, who look at their bodies as being loved by God, as being the gift of what they are given, and are not looking to be healed. And in fact, they see the stigma of society that says that because they are not like everyone else, because their bodies are different, that's actually the problem. That's the disease. And it's a disease that exists in us who do not see how wonderfully made they are and how wonderful and fulfilled their lives can be when they are treated equally. So I think that these are questions that healing and miracles do ask. So, for example, if we were just to phrase this as a case study, if Jesus had encountered Nancy, I wonder whether she would have asked for healing. I think the answer is no. She's pretty clear about that. To the extent that she says, she writes in this book that if she has a body in the next life, she really expects that it would be have the same condition that her body had in this life, that she would still be in a wheelchair, even if she were in heaven, because she says she would not recognize her body, and the effort that she had gone to find love for her body would have somewhat be wasted. She would be alienated from her sense of self if suddenly she was restored to a more normal looking body. And she is someone who did use a wheelchair for her entire life. Let me read to you from her book. It says, to see both sides of this. She says, my own history with laying on of hands has been an ambiguous one. Often the practice has been closely associated with ritual healing. I, like many people with disabilities, have experienced the negative effects of healing rituals. Healing has been the churchly parallel to rehabilitative medicine, in which the goal was normalization of the bodies of people with disabilities. Healing is expected to change the person who has a disability into one who does not. The burden of healing is placed totally on the person who is disabled, causing further suffering and continued alienation from the church. Failure to be healed is often assessed as a personal flaw in the individual, such as unrepentant sin or selfish desire to remain disabled. Thus, for many people with disabilities, laying on of hands is associated with their stigmatization within the church. Yet, she writes, I have also experienced laying on of hands that was restorative and redemptive. These physical mediations of God's grace have often kept me related to my body at times when all of my impulses pushed me towards dissociating from the pain-racked, uncomfortable beast. For example, as a child, after spending several months in hospitals having my body rebuilt surgically, I was a participant in a powerful service of laying on of hands. In a charismatic meeting in a rural North Dakota parish, I experienced the body care of several elderly nuns schooled in physical attendance as nurses and touched by the Spirit as Christians. Their touch and tears were the body practices of inclusion. My body belonged in the church. From that early age, I recall the physical sensation of having my body redeemed for God, as those spiritual women laid hands on me, caressing my pain, lifting my isolation, and revealing my spiritual body. For people with disabilities, such experiences of physical redemption, ordinary inclusion, are rare. So she looks at both sides of this idea of what does healing look like, that healing can in some ways be the inclusion, the welcome of someone back to church, to the society, to the culture. as much as it can be really harmful if we demand miracles of healing for people that don't see themselves as needing that, or also that realistically will not experience the healing that maybe we think would restore them back to a normal life. We need to recognize that that's just our projection onto them. So would Jesus heal a body, or would Jesus heal a society that thought that a disabled body was somehow less important or less beautiful? I think that's an open question. And I think that our role, our gift, our responsibility is to see how we can, as a church, heal society from some of its assumptions about what normal looks like. Okay, going on. Chapter 1 is not the only verse of healing and demon exorcism. There's another one here in Mark 5:1 that I think is really interesting as well. Let's go through this. They came to the region near Gerasa on the other side of the lake, and when he had disembarked, immediately a person with an unclean spirit met them. The possessed one lived among the tombs and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. In fact, shackles and fetters had been used as restraints to no avail. No one had proved strong enough to subdue the demoniac. The sufferer would use stones to gash the flesh, howling day and night among the tombs and the mountain crags without interruption. Catching sight of Jesus, the bedeviled one ran up and bowed down to Jesus, and then started shrieking in a loud voice, "What do you want from me, Jesus, firstborn of the Most High? Swear by God that you won't torture me," for Jesus had been saying, "Come out of this person, unclean spirit." "What is your name?" Jesus asked. "My name is Legion, for there are many of us," was the reply. And the possessed one begged Jesus not to send them out of the area. Now there was a large herd of pigs feeding on the mountainside, and the unclean spirits begged Jesus, "Send us to the pigs so we can enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and with that, the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd of about 2,000 went rushing down the cliff into the lake, and there they drowned. The swineherds ran off and reported this in the town and in the countryside, and the people came to see what really had happened. As they approached Jesus, they caught sight of the one who had been possessed sitting there fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were filled with fear. The spectators explained what had happened to the possessed person and told the townspeople about the pigs. Then the crowd began to implore Jesus to leave their district. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the one who had been healed came up and begged to be allowed to go with him. Jesus answered, "Go home to your people and tell them about what God has done for you." So the former demoniac went off and proceeded to proclaim throughout the 10 cities what Jesus had done. Everyone was amazed at what they heard. A couple interesting things here. I think that this is continuing the theme of that power, that this might have been a case of a demon being exorcised, perhaps, but there's also a lot to be learned here, treating this as allegory. So Jesus is confronting a power in a person, and that power has a name. It's legion, and that's a really interesting word because it describes the Roman occupying forces, who were called legions. It's a military term. Furthermore, these legions are many. They are us. And when they are sent off, or when Jesus threatens them, they are afraid not to be sent out of this person, but to be sent out of this country. So furthering the idea that this is not a story about a demonic spirit occupying a person. It's about a demonic spirit, rather a demonic force, occupying force in a geographical area. When they go, when they're driven out and they enter the swine and run to the sea and are killed, this is explicitly recalling the drowning of the Egyptian forces in the Red Sea. Although it's a reversal, because in that case, the invaders, who are the Israelites, are the good guys. They're the ones that are being saved by someone drowning, by the Egyptians drowning. In this case, the invaders, the Romans, are the ones being driven out and drowned. So it's recalling a time of being saved from Exodus, but it's also reversing that imagery and identifying the force that is being criticized, the bad guys, as being actually the invaders here. Another thing, this demoniac is identified as being insane, as being demon-possessed, partly because they practice self-harm. It has been, if we're going to, as we're building towards a post-colonial critique of empire through this passage, we've noticed that it is empire that is the demon. The site that is being occupied, that is being demon possessed, this person is facing an overwhelming force. And perhaps sometimes to be possessed, to be occupied, is itself maddening. It drives one to do horrible things. To the extent that when you're faced with overwhelming oppression, that self-harm, self-annihilation can be a form of resistance. In this case, this is why the person hurt themselves, that it could not be restrained. And when we look at what we've learned in politics for the last, 2,000 years, oftentimes it's not without a purpose that someone might hurt themselves as a form of resistance. Because as has been written, out of the ashes of martyrs, out of the ashes of self-immolation, of self-annihilation, rebellions are often born. And it sounds a lot like Star Wars, but it's actually postcolonial thought from, let me find the author, from Stephen Moore. It's a great essay on Mark and Empire, Zealot and Postcolonial Readings. So I recommend this book here. Our citations are below the video in the description, by the way, for all of our readings. So we have many features here that kind of belay a different way to think about authority and power that are consistent with the way that Jesus challenges authority throughout the Gospel of Mark. One last thing that's kind of unusual. After people find out about Jesus exorcising this demonic spirit, you'd think that they'd want Jesus to stick around. This is a good guy, right? Someone who has cleared out a bad force from the area. But they ask Jesus to leave. That's really weird. On the other hand, we know that what it is to resist empire brings about swift retribution from empire. And so these people maybe were scared about what punishment was about or this is an allegory detailing people's normal response, which is to be afraid of the retribution that will come from empire when its power is challenged. So in the case of the earlier revolt, the Jewish revolt that we were talking about as a historical incident, as a result of overwhelming occupation in 66 CE, the Jewish people revolt, but the Roman Empire responds with crushing defeat, the destruction of Jerusalem. And so that's what these people are afraid of, and that's why they ask Jesus to leave here in this case. So it can seem like the Gospel of Mark is a really helpful text to be able to form a resistance to empire, to overwhelming power. But it's also been noted by authors that are not from the West. The traditional readings of Mark as a post-colonial text that resists authority generally come from the West. So they have names like Myers or Hamerton or Kelly. But when we read from Asia and Africa, we notice that there's a different way to read Mark as well, one that's a little bit more ambiguous about Mark's kind of allyship as a post-colonial thinker. So this is going to largely be dependent on an essay by Benny Liew, who's a New Testament scholar from Hong Kong. And he looks at three different things to ask the question about whether Mark is really challenging authority or is actually mimicking colonial authority. So that's what colonial mimicry means. Has Mark, the author of Mark, internalized the ways that empire exercises authority and mimicking the same methods of oppression, even though it's trying to resist empire? Is it actually kind of making the problem worse or perpetuating the same methods? And in that way, is maybe Mark a text that we should regard with some suspicion and not just love it as a way to be able to, as a model to resist empire. So just as a explanation for this image here, this is a moment in history, 1980, April 16th, when Zimbabwe was decolonized. So when Prince Charles, who is on the right and white, hands over power to Robert Mugabe on the left and his cabinet. So it is a decolonial moment of no question, because Britain is granting independence to Southern Rhodesia, would become Zimbabwe. On the other hand, we know that from 1980 to 2017, Robert Mugabe essentially ruled as a dictator. So had re-entrenched the same methods of oppressive rule that the British had taught against his own people. So sometimes decolonization can also be a moment of neocolonialism as well. It's not necessarily in and of itself the solution to every problem. It has to still be done with much thought. So let's look at the Gospel of Mark from a critical angle and ask whether this is actually a gospel that challenges authority, or this is a gospel that actually could be seen to be really in bed with authority, and maybe we should be more cautious before we adopt the language of Mark and the thinking of Mark without understanding how it could also be harmful. So when Benny Liew, I still think of him as Professor Liew, who's my New Testament professor, looks at the idea of authority in Mark. He sees that Jesus commands authority. Jesus has the authority to heal and to forgive sins, just as we saw in this miracle. But Jesus is not willing to challenge the idea of authority itself, just relocates authority and critiques categories of authority. The type of authority that's bad, Jesus thinks, is the old hollow authority of the past, of the scribes. But the new authority is good. And so Jesus claims that authority for himself and regards himself as being far above his disciples, far above reproach. When he interprets Hebrew scripture, he interprets it at will and sometimes says one thing and sometimes contradicts himself in other ways, but claims the authority to interpret scripture however he wants, Hebrew scripture however he wants. And so he says, for example, that the rich should sell all they have to the poor to take care of the poor, and at the same time accepts a gift of extravagant perfume from a widow. When he speaks about fasting, Jesus says that I am the reason you fast. I define fasting. I in my person. The theme for many of these stories throughout the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus claims authority because of who Jesus is. And that is defined, that's expressed in the transfiguration, in the baptism, in the parable of the vineyard, or even in the crucifixion as being God's beloved. That because of God, who God is, or because of who Jesus is both the good news, the gospel, as well as the one proclaiming the gospel. Because of who Jesus is, not because of what Jesus does, Jesus has authority and power. And that can seem like it makes a lot of sense, right? God is God. We should give to God all authority and power. The problem is that when we internalize that logic, when we associate power with identity, this is a logic that can also be used very destructively. It's the logic behind white nationalism, for example, that says that because of my skin color, because of who I am and how I was born, I am granted authority over other people. It's also the authority and power that was used essentially to justify Europe conquering and subjugating places far away because they were just thought to be naturally barbarians or uncivilized and needing of rule. So power that is not deserved, power that is not given, is something that many people from the global South, from places not European, not Western, are very suspicious of. So if we go on, when we look at ways that Jesus regards his disciples and how Jesus exercises power, there are some disturbing parallels. It's true that within the disciples, there is no greatest release. So the disciples are all flat. I mean, there is no exercise of authority within them. So there is equality. But the difference between Jesus and the disciples essentially is so great that it means that the disciples get treated as servants. They're gophers. They clean things. They gather crumbs. They get things for Jesus. They're not really given authority or autonomy or personhood in this gospel. They're generally criticized for being hard-hearted and hard-headed, so dumb and mean, but are not appreciated, it seems like, not humanized in any great way. When Peter disagrees with Jesus at the first passion prediction, Peter is called Satan and that's defined as someone who has their mind on human affairs rather than divine things. So it means that disagreeing with Jesus, not having the mind of Jesus, makes you Satan. And the disciples are instructed to reject anyone who rejects Jesus. So the problem here is that these are really crude methods of polarization. So the authority divide that Jesus assumes also then leads to a really binary way of thinking of out versus in, us versus them, in or out. And that kind of binary, that kind of thinking of in and out, kind of makes the disciples what has been written about in literature as not just Jesus's sidekicks, but turning them into essentially loyal satellites, personified colonies of the Messiah, uh, so that they are inside as long as they serve and as long as they obey. But as soon as they transgress that boundary, they are with no worth. We are all welcome to respond to Jesus in Mark's gospel. And so that's great news, right? It doesn't mean if you're Jew or Greek or woman or male, we're all given the same opportunity. But if you're on the outside, the only thing that awaits you is destruction. The wicked are to be destroyed, Mark writes. Those who reject Jesus will be rejected. And it's worse than just a tit for tat. In chapter 4, verse 24, it said that what measure you measure with, it will be measured against you with added proportion. As Benny Liew writes, this is interest incurring debt of violence. So it's violence plus interest accrued. So this is an authoritative Jesus that annihilates all opponents, and it duplicates the colonial choice of serve or be destroyed. It's not really a choice, really, because it's based on the colonial rationalization that certain people have been proven to be too barbaric, too evil, or too underdeveloped to have free choice or to live. They don't deserve that. So all they are given is the right to serve. The deity, Jesus, like most human power systems, promotes a hierarchical, punitive, and tyrannical concept of the ruler and the ruled, while claiming that this authority and this power structure is all for the best. So that requires us to have some degree of separation, to be able to say, wait, hold on. Like, I accept that God is bigger than me, fine. But is the way that I'm taught to be only a subject, that I have only the choice to worship God, to agree with God? Is that really a loving way to relate? And should I reproduce that same assumption in my relationships with other people? We learn from the power systems that we are subject to, and we tend to treat other people in the same ways. So the suspicion here from writers like Liew or Chow or Dubé is that Mark can't be taken wholesale, that there is some degree of suspicion that should be applied to the Gospel of Mark, much less we commit the sin of treating other people the same way that God treats us, which is hierarchical, punitive, tyrannical. And it's best expressed when we understand that power is Jesus's authority. And this goes back to chapter 1, that our first story from today, that Jesus' authority is expressed in Jesus' power over demons, power to heal. There are other ways to express authority, through love, through reconciliation, through sacrifice. But so much of what Mark seems to be concerned about uniquely is Jesus's power. So the point here is that in the second coming, which is one of Mark's major preoccupations, wrongs will be righted by the annihilation of the wicked. Vindication is vindictive, and power is defeated with more power. So what do you do when you go up against something powerful? You bring more power, and that's how you defeat it. This is essentially might is right ideology. And it has justified the conquering of multiple peoples around this world by other humans who are building empires. So on the one hand, yes, it's a good thing that evil is defeated. On the other hand, we are smart enough as Christians to have multiple ways to defeat evil, through love, through what seems like weakness, but actually is strength, but to just meet power with power, as Mark's gospel might model for us if we don't think about it very critically, would be a mistake. So here it is both an example as well as a caution. The question here is, at the end of the day, that I want to leave you with, Mark has so many wonderfully personal relations or stories of miracles that speak to personal relationships with Jesus, things that I like, things that I want to own. So can we own a text and disown a text at the same time? Can we have the complexity to be able to understand how Mark can be used in dangerous ways if it's not thought about very critically? And can we also recognize the parts of Mark that really speak to the core of who we are and what we aspire to do and be? This is the lesson here to be thought of when we think about miracles and exorcisms and what they mean about our relationship with Jesus. Great, thank you.